The shuttle shook so hard my restraints cut into my shoulders, and the pilot's voice cracked through the comm, telling me we had lost 2 engines before I even understood we were under fire. My name is Nathan Cole, and 3 hours before that moment, I had been the 4th member of a 5-person delegation sent to answer for the future of an entire species. Now I was the only one still breathing, strapped into a chair designed for a body twice my size, watching red warning lights paint the cabin while something outside tried to make sure I never reached the chamber at all. I did not know yet who had ordered the strike against our shuttle. I only knew it had come from a small, unmarked vessel that broke away the second we entered the approach corridor to the council station, and that whoever sent it clearly did not want a human standing in that chamber to speak on humanity's behalf. The pilot, a young officer named Owen Grant, fought the controls with both hands, sweat running down his neck, shouting numbers I did not understand at a systems display that was losing more lights than it was keeping lit. I remember gripping the edge of my seat and thinking, with a strange, distant clarity, that if we did not survive the next 90 seconds, the council would simply reschedule the hearing and move on, the way you reschedule a meeting when someone cancels. We survived, barely, clipping the edge of a docking ring hard enough to crack 2 viewports before emergency clamps caught the hull and dragged us to a stop. I remember unbuckling with hands that would not stop shaking, stepping out into a station corridor lined with beings who did not so much as glance at the smoking wreck behind me, because near misses were apparently not worth their attention. Nobody explained the attack. Nobody apologized for it. A council escort simply arrived, informed me the hearing would proceed as scheduled in 40 minutes, and walked away as if a shuttle full of humans nearly dying on their doorstep was a matter for someone else's department. I understood, standing there with my hands still trembling, that I had just been given my first real lesson about how this alliance actually worked. Nothing here happened by accident, and nothing here would ever be treated as urgent unless it inconvenienced the council directly. I walked into that chamber 40 minutes later, with 3 empty seats beside me, where my colleagues should have been. Killed not in the shuttle, but 2 days earlier, in what our own government had been told was an unrelated accident during final preparations. I did not believe that explanation before I boarded the shuttle. I believed it even less after watching an unmarked ship try to finish the job. The chamber itself was a ring of light, rising in floating tiers so high I lost count of the levels before my eyes gave up trying to follow them. 700 delegates watched me take my place, and I understood immediately from their stillness that every one of them already knew how today would end, the same way you know how a story ends when you have read 100 versions of it before. A being named Administrator Vell opened the session. His voice was smooth and patient, the voice of someone reading a verdict he had written a week ago and was only now getting around to announcing. He said humanity had been observed for 11 years. He said our species showed patterns that concerned the Council deeply, and he listed our wars, our history of expansion, our stubborn refusal to accept correction from wiser species, describing all of it the way a doctor describes a disease, clinical and detached, as if I were not standing 3 meters away listening to him summarize my entire civilization as a symptom. I asked to respond, and he allowed it, the way you allow a child to speak before sending them to their room regardless of what they say. I told them about our cities rebuilt after disasters, about the cures we found for illnesses that once erased whole generations, about strangers who pull other strangers out of danger without knowing their names. I told them that judging an entire species by its worst moments was like judging an ocean by a single wave, and that if they wanted to understand what humanity actually was, they needed to look at what we built in the quiet years between our mistakes, not just the mistakes themselves. Nobody in that chamber moved. When I finished, Vell thanked me for my testimony in a tone that made clear he had not needed to hear a single word of it, because the vote had already happened somewhere smaller, days before I ever set foot inside that room. The verdict came fast after that, the way sentences always come faster than the trials that produce them. Earth would be placed under what they called a correction quarantine. Our colonies beyond the solar system, all 4 of them, would be reassigned to council administration for what they described as their own protection. Our long-range fleet would be decommissioned under Council supervision within one standard cycle, and any resistance to these terms, Vel added, almost gently, would be treated as confirmation of everything the Council already suspected about us. I asked what would happen to the humans living on those colonies. He said they would be relocated to Earth for their safety. I asked what would happen if we refused. His colors shifted to something close to amusement, and he said no species in recorded history had ever refused a correction quarantine and survived the consequences of that choice. I looked around that chamber at 700 delegates who had clearly watched this same performance before. Some other species told the same thing in the same tone, and I understood that none of them would speak up for us, because speaking up had never once worked, not for anyone, not in this room. The flight home mattered more to me than the hearing itself, because it gave me time to think about what had actually happened before I stepped back into a station where every camera would be watching my face. I sat with Owen Grant, the pilot who had kept us alive through the attack, and I asked him whether he believed the strike against our shuttle had come from the Council itself or from someone acting without their approval. He said it did not matter which one was true, because either way, someone had wanted the world to hear the Council's verdict without a human voice pushing back against it first, and either way, that told us everything we needed to know about how much our survival counted for in that room. I stared out the viewport at Earth growing larger, blue and stubborn and completely unaware that its future had just been decided by beings who had spent maybe 40 minutes discussing it, and I thought about my sister Nora Cole, who worked on the colony at Meridian Station, one of the 4 the Council had just claimed as their own. I wondered if she would be told to pack her entire life into a single crate and call it protection. When I landed, the world already knew. It had been broadcast across every screen on the planet, every word of Vel's verdict repeated by news services that had no idea yet how to explain it to people going about their ordinary lives. I walked out of the shuttle bay into a silence that felt heavier than the chamber had. Not shocked silence, not confused silence, but the kind of silence a species makes right before it decides what kind of species it is going to be from now on. Grace Whitfield met me on the tarmac. She led what remained of our diplomatic council, and she had watched the entire hearing from a secure feed at headquarters, along with footage of our shuttle limping into the station trailing smoke. She did not ask me how the hearing went. She asked me one question instead, quiet, almost gentle, the kind of question you ask someone you are about to burden with something enormous. She asked if I believed the attack on our shuttle had been meant to stop me from reaching that chamber at all. I told her yes, without hesitation, because I had thought of nothing else since the moment the pilot's voice cracked through the comm. I told her that whoever ordered that strike understood exactly what it would mean if a human voice, however small, reached that room and forced even one delegate to hesitate before voting. I told her that meant something we had not fully accounted for. Somewhere in that alliance, someone was already afraid of what humanity might become, long before we had done anything to earn that fear. Grace absorbed that in silence for a long moment before she spoke again. She told me the emergency council was meeting within the hour, and she wanted me there, because I was the only person alive who had watched their faces while they decided our future, and now the only person alive who had watched someone try to make sure I never got the chance. I did not sleep that night. I do not think anyone in a position of power on Earth slept that night. I sat in briefing rooms lit by cold white light, listening to admirals and scientists and diplomats argue over whether compliance was survival or surrender, whether resistance was courage or suicide. Nobody had a clean answer. I remember Marcus Vane, one of our fleet commanders, saying something that stayed with me for the rest of my life. He said a quarantine only works on something that agrees to stay quiet, and he said the council had clearly never had to quarantine something that refused, let alone something someone had already tried to silence before it could speak at all. I did not know yet how right he was. None of us did. We were still, in that room, a species arguing about how to survive a decision made by strangers, and a decision, we were only beginning to suspect, that someone in that alliance had been desperate enough to protect with force before it was even finalized. They had called us unrefined. They had called us dangerous. They had never once asked what we would do if pushed into a corner with no honest way out. And somewhere in that unmarked ship that tried to end my life before I ever reached the chamber, someone had already answered that question for themselves, long before the rest of the galaxy ever would. I stood at the window of that briefing room as dawn broke over the coastline, the first light catching the towers below, ordinary people walking to ordinary jobs with no idea that somewhere above their heads a countdown had already started, and that the first shot in that countdown had already been fired at me, hours before anyone else on Earth even knew the verdict existed. 30 days. That was what the quarantine order gave us before it took effect. 30 days to hand over our colonies. 30 days to begin dismantling our fleet. 30 days for a species that had just been told, in front of the entire galaxy, that it did not deserve a say in its own future, and that someone, somewhere, had already been frightened enough by the possibility of us speaking up to try ending that possibility with fire, before the sun even rose on the first of those 30 days. I did not know it then, standing in that briefing room with the light coming up over the coastline, but those 30 days were the last quiet days the galaxy would ever know. Somewhere in the wreckage of that shuttle, in the silence that followed my testimony, in the fear that had clearly driven someone to try silencing me before I ever spoke, something in humanity had already started to change. Not our anger. Anger burns fast and dies faster. Something colder than anger. Something that plans, and something that had just been given its first piece of proof that we were right to be afraid of exactly how far this would go. The alert tone that woke me was not the soft chime we used for routine updates. It was the sharp three-note signal reserved for one thing only, and I was out of bed and pulling on my uniform before I had even fully processed what my own ears had just told me. Meridian Station had gone dark. I ran through the corridors of headquarters with my heart hammering, past officers who moved with the same frantic urgency I felt in my own chest, until I reached the command center and found Grace Whitfield already there, her face lit by the pale glow of a display showing a single word repeated across every channel we had once used to communicate with my sister's colony. Silence. A young communications officer named Oliver Finch sat at the main console, his hands trembling as he tried every frequency we had ever used, every backup relay, every emergency channel built into that station's design specifically for moments like this one. Nothing answered. Not static, not a garbled distress call, nothing at all, and I remember thinking that nothing was somehow worse than the worst news we could have received, because nothing left room for every possibility to keep circling in my mind at once. I asked Oliver how long the silence had lasted. He told me 11 minutes, and that a single automated distress ping had gone out before the station's systems failed entirely, a ping that gave coordinates and nothing else. No voice, no explanation, just a location and then nothing. I remember Marcus Vane arriving moments later, already briefed, already grim in a way that told me he suspected exactly what had happened before anyone confirmed it. He said a Council enforcement vessel had been detected entering that system 9 hours earlier, well ahead of the 30-day deadline we had all been counting toward, and that its presence had been logged but not flagged as an immediate threat, because nobody, not even Marcus, had believed the Council would move before the deadline they themselves had announced. I asked him directly whether he thought the ship had caused this. He did not answer right away. He simply pulled up a secondary feed, older data captured by a relay satellite in that system before it too went silent, showing a single Council vessel positioned above the colony for reasons that had no other explanation once you saw the timeline laid out beside it. I do not remember much of the next several hours in detail, only fragments. I remember Grace sitting beside me in a small room off the command center, not saying anything useful because there was nothing useful to say, just sitting there so I would not have to sit there alone. I remember staring at a photograph on my console of my sister, Nora Cole, standing in front of a colony she had helped build with her own hands, smiling in a way that had nothing to do with the silence now surrounding everything she had ever touched. Confirmation came 2 days later, delivered not through any diplomatic channel, but through a Council statement broadcast publicly to every species in their alliance, describing the action at Meridian Station as a necessary correction in response to what they called unauthorized resistance broadcasts originating from the colony in the days before the strike. I watched that statement 3 times, searching each time for some acknowledgement that thousands of people had lived and worked and built something on that station, and each time I found nothing, just the word correction, repeated like it explained anything at all. Nora's name moved from the list of the missing to a different list on the 9th day. I do not remember who told me. I remember only the sound of my own breathing in the silence that followed, and Oliver Finch quietly closing the console in front of me before I had to look at it any longer than necessary. That was the moment I understood something every human alive felt in their bones during those 9 days, even if we did not yet have words for it. The Council did not see us as a civilization capable of grief. They saw us as a variable to be adjusted, and a variable, once adjusted, is not expected to remember. They were wrong about that. We remembered everything, and I remembered the shuttle attack that had nearly killed me before the verdict was even announced, and I understood now, with a clarity that felt almost physical, that both events had come from the same place. Fear, dressed up as authority, moving first, and explaining itself later, if it ever bothered to explain itself at all. I want to be honest about what happened inside our own government in the weeks after Meridian Station, because it was not simple, and it was not unanimous, and I think that complexity matters more than any clean story of unity would. There were people, good people, who argued that retaliation would only invite worse. Henry Adler, one of our senior diplomats, stood in front of the Emergency Council and argued that our best chance of survival was full compliance, immediate and total, in the hope that the Council would see it as proof we had learned our lesson. He was not a coward. He had buried a daughter on Meridian Station 3 years before all of this began, and he still believed compliance was the only path that did not end with every human being erased the same way she had been. I disagreed with him completely, but I never once doubted that he believed what he was saying, and I think it matters that people remember he existed, because history has a way of flattening disagreement into villains and heroes, when the truth is almost always more complicated than that. Marcus Vane took the opposite position, and he took it loudly. He argued that compliance had already failed because we had spent 11 years being observed and judged and found wanting, despite doing nothing the Council could reasonably call provocation, and now someone within their alliance had tried to silence a single human voice before it ever reached their chamber, and thousands more had been erased before the deadline they themselves announced had even arrived. He argued that a species willing to do both of those things was not a species that would ever be satisfied by obedience, because obedience was never actually the goal. Control was the goal, and control, once granted, is never given back voluntarily. I remember the vote that followed, not because it was dramatic, but because it was so quiet. There was no cheering, no triumphant speeches, just a room full of exhausted, grieving people raising their hands, one by one, to approve something none of us wanted to approve, because every alternative we could see led to the same place, only slower. Earth would not comply with the quarantine. Earth would prepare for what came next. What came next did not look like war, not at first. It looked like silence of a different kind. Every public statement from our government became careful, measured, almost apologetic, the kind of language designed to buy time rather than provoke a response. Behind that silence, something else was happening, something that had actually begun years before Meridian Station, in ways I did not fully understand until much later. I learned, slowly, over the following weeks, that humanity had never actually stopped preparing for the possibility of exactly this outcome, even during the years when public leadership spoke only of cooperation and diplomacy with the wider galaxy. There had been a program, quiet and compartmentalized, run by a small group of scientists and engineers who had never believed the Council's patience would last. Elena Brooks led that program. I met her for the first time 19 days after Meridian Station, in a facility built into a mountain range that did not appear on any public map, and I remember thinking she looked less like a scientist and more like someone who had spent years carrying a secret so heavy it had permanently changed her posture. Elena did not waste time on comfort or reassurance. She told me plainly that her team had spent over a decade developing capabilities we had never revealed to the Council, not because we intended to use them offensively, but because every historical record we had gathered about other species suggested that first contact with an advanced alliance rarely ended well for the less powerful side. She said her team had operated on a simple principle: hope for the best outcome, but do not build your survival plan around it. I asked her what exactly her team had built. She told me it would be easier to show me than to explain it, and she led me deeper into that mountain, through corridors lined with technology I did not recognize, past rooms full of people who barely looked up as we passed, too focused on their work to acknowledge visitors. I remember the strange, quiet intensity of that place, the sense that everyone inside it had accepted, long before the rest of us had, that this day might come. What Elena's team had built was not one single weapon or one single strategy. It was something closer to a philosophy translated into engineering. They had studied every piece of Council technology we had ever been permitted to observe, every pattern in how their enforcement vessels moved, every weakness in how an alliance built on hundreds of different species actually made decisions. They had concluded, correctly as it turned out, that the Council's real vulnerability was not technological at all. It was structural. An alliance of that many species, each with different priorities and different tolerances for risk, could be extraordinarily powerful when united and extraordinarily fragile when that unity cracked. I asked her, standing in that corridor, whether she believed what we were building could actually work. She looked at me for a long moment before answering, and when she finally spoke, her voice was quieter than I expected. She said the Council had spent centuries fighting species that reacted the way they expected species to react. Predictable anger, predictable escalation, predictable surrender once the cost grew too high. She said humanity's only real advantage was that we had never been predictable, not even to ourselves, and that if we used that unpredictability carefully, instead of wasting it on rage, we might survive long enough to make the Council regret ever setting foot near Meridian Station, and regret ever ordering that unmarked ship toward my shuttle before I had even finished speaking a single word in our defense. Grace Whitfield joined our efforts fully in the weeks that followed, stepping away from the diplomatic channels that had defined her entire career, because she said there was no longer anyone on the other side actually listening. Oliver Finch transferred from communications into what became known internally as the Coordination Division, helping link Elena's scientific teams with military planners like Marcus Vane, who had already begun reorganizing what remained of our fleet around strategies nobody outside a handful of secure rooms would ever hear about until much later. I remember the exact moment our approach shifted from defense to something else entirely. It came during a briefing 3 weeks after Meridian Station, when Marcus laid out a map of Council territory, drawn from years of quiet intelligence gathering that predated even the quarantine order. He pointed to systems most of us had never heard named before, worlds populated by species who had joined the Council's alliance not out of loyalty, but out of fear of what happened to those who refused. He said something that stayed with me long after that room emptied. He said the Council had built an empire out of species too afraid to say no, and an empire built on fear does not need to be conquered. It only needs to be shown, clearly and unmistakably, that the thing it fears has changed. I asked him what he meant by that. He said humanity was about to stop being the thing the Council feared quietly, in private reports and closed hearings, and start becoming the thing every species in that alliance feared, openly, loudly, and permanently. I did not fully understand what he meant that day. I understood it completely a few months later, when I stood in a command chair of my own and watched the first phase of our answer begin. But that is a story for what came after. In those early weeks, all I knew was this. Somewhere above us, the Council believed it had already won, because it had silenced our colonies, frightened our leadership into 30 days of careful, apologetic diplomacy, and nearly silenced the one human voice that had dared to speak in that chamber before the verdict was even final. It had no idea that inside a mountain that did not appear on any map, a species it had judged unrefined and dangerous had already decided exactly how far it was willing to go. They had shown us what correction looked like at Meridian Station. We were about to show them what consequence looked like everywhere else. A containment alarm tore through the mountain facility at 2 in the morning, and I was on my feet with my heart slamming before I even registered the words coming through the overhead speakers, because in a place built to hide the most dangerous project humanity had ever attempted, an alarm like that meant something had gone badly wrong with something we could not afford to lose control of. I reached the lower testing level to find Elena Brooks already there, her voice sharp and controlled, as she directed a team pulling a containment field back into alignment around a device that had, for 11 seconds, threatened to release far more energy than anyone in that room had planned for. I remember the sweat on her face, the way her hands did not shake even as everyone around her moved with barely restrained panic, and I remember thinking that this was the first time I had seen fear on her, real fear, not for herself, but for what would happen to every plan we had built if this particular piece of it failed before it was ever needed. She stabilized it herself, working the controls with a precision that told me she had trained for exactly this scenario more times than she would ever admit. When the alarm finally cut off and the lights returned to their normal steady white, she stood there for a long moment, breathing hard, before turning to the rest of us and saying quietly that we had just gotten a preview of what happens when preparation moves faster than caution allows. That single night changed the pace of everything that followed, because it forced all of us to confront a question none of us had asked clearly enough before. How much were we willing to risk, not from the Council, but from ourselves, in the effort to build something capable of standing against them? We called the project the Continuance, a name Elena chose because she said it described what we were actually doing better than any word involving weapons or war ever could. We were not building an army to conquer anyone. We were building the means to make sure humanity continued to exist, on our own terms, after the Council had already decided our continuation was negotiable, and after someone within that alliance had already tried, twice now, to make certain we never got the chance to argue otherwise. I spent the months after that near miss learning things I never expected to learn. I sat in rooms with engineers who had spent a decade designing propulsion systems that borrowed principles from Council technology we were never supposed to have studied closely enough to understand, let alone improve upon. I sat in rooms with strategists like Marcus Vane, who spoke about the psychology of alliances the way a physician speaks about the human body, identifying pressure points, fractures, places where a single well-placed action could cause damage far beyond its size. I sat in rooms with people like Claire Bennett, a linguist who had spent years studying Council communications, not for their content, but for the patterns underneath the content, the small tells that revealed which member species trusted the Council completely and which ones stayed in the alliance purely out of fear. Claire's work mattered more than I understood at first. She explained it to me one evening in the facility's main hall, over a meal neither of us finished because the conversation kept pulling our attention away from the food. She told me the Council's alliance included over 300 member species, and that fewer than 20 of them had ever actually voted against a Council decision in recorded history. She said this was not because those species agreed with every decision. It was because dissent within the alliance had a documented pattern of ending badly for whoever expressed it. She had found records, buried deep in translated archives, of species who had once questioned Council authority and were later reduced, quietly, to administrative footnotes, the same way Meridian Station had been. I asked her what that meant for us. She said it meant the alliance was not built on loyalty, it was built on silence, and silence, unlike loyalty, could be broken if the right species finally gave the rest of them a reason to believe breaking it was survivable. That idea became the foundation of everything Elena's team designed after that. We were not simply preparing technology to use against the Council directly, we were preparing evidence, carefully gathered and verified, of exactly how the Council had treated species who stepped out of line throughout its long history. We were preparing a demonstration, not just of what humanity could do if pushed, but of what the Council had always been willing to do to anyone who displeased it, regardless of how that species had once been welcomed into the Alliance. Not everyone in that mountain facility agreed on how far this preparation should go, and I think it is important to say that clearly, because I never want anyone to believe what came later happened without struggle or doubt. There were nights when Henry Adler, still grieving, still uncertain, would join our briefings uninvited, arguing that even now, even after everything, there might be a path back toward negotiation that did not require what Elena's team was building. I remember one particular evening when he stood in front of Marcus Vane and asked him directly whether he could live with what he was about to help create. Marcus did not answer quickly. I remember that pause more than almost anything else from those months, because Marcus was not a man who paused often. When he finally spoke, he said he had asked himself that same question every single night since Meridian Station, and that his answer had not changed. He said he could live with defending a future for people who were not yet born. What he could not live with was standing by while the Council decided humanity's future belonged to them, simply because we had once been too trusting to imagine anyone would take it. Henry did not have a response to that. None of us did. He stayed with the project after that night, though I do not think his doubts ever fully disappeared, and I have come to believe that his doubts, carried quietly alongside the rest of our resolve, were part of what kept the entire effort grounded in something more careful than pure anger. I remember Oliver Finch spending long nights building a communications framework that would allow us to broadcast directly into Council territory if the moment ever came, bypassing the layers of translation and filtering the Council normally controlled. He told me once, half joking, that he had never expected his career in communications to end with him designing a way to make sure the entire galaxy heard the truth at the exact same moment, in a language every species in that alliance could understand without Council interference deciding what parts they were allowed to hear. I remember Grace Whitfield working quietly with a small group of former diplomats, cataloging every meeting, every hearing, every promise the Council had made to Earth over the previous 11 years, and broken without consequence. She said she was not building a case for war. She was building a record, so that whatever happened next, no species watching from the outside could later claim they simply had not known what kind of alliance they belonged to. There was a moment, about 8 months after that first alarm tore through the lower testing level, when Elena gathered the senior members of the project into a single room and told us something that changed the tone of everything that followed. She said her teams had finished. Not finished refining, not finished testing, but finished the essential work required to make our answer to the Council, whenever it came, something the entire galaxy would remember. I remember the silence that followed her announcement. It was not the silence of celebration. It was the silence of people who understood that finishing something like this meant a choice now sat in front of us that could no longer be delayed indefinitely. We could continue preparing forever, refining endlessly, or we could accept that preparation had reached its natural end, and that the only thing left to determine was when, not if, we would use what we had built. Marcus Vane was the one who finally broke that silence. He said the Council would not wait for us to feel ready. He said the 30-day deadline from the original quarantine order had long since passed, and that the only reason the Council had not yet launched a larger response was because our public silence, carefully maintained by leaders like Grace, had convinced them we were simply too frightened to resist further. He said that illusion would not last forever, and that when it broke, we needed to be the ones who chose the moment it broke, rather than allowing the Council to choose it for us. I remember Henry Adler speaking again that night, quieter than before, no longer arguing against what we had built, but asking instead what would happen to the ordinary people of Earth if this went as badly as it possibly could. Elena answered him herself this time. She said the ordinary people of Earth had already lived through the worst version of doing nothing, back on Meridian Station, and that the only real question left was whether we would let that happen again somewhere else, to someone else's sister, someone else's daughter, simply because we had convinced ourselves that waiting felt safer than acting. I thought about my sister that night more than I had allowed myself to in months. I thought about the photograph still sitting on my console, of her smiling in front of a colony that no longer existed. I thought about Administrator Vell's voice, calm and untroubled, describing her death and the deaths of thousands like her as a necessary correction. I thought about the unmarked ship that had tried to end my life before I ever spoke a single word in that chamber. And I understood, sitting in that room full of exhausted, determined people, that whatever came next, we were no longer preparing out of fear. We were preparing because somewhere along the way, grief had quietly become resolve, and resolve, unlike fear, does not ask permission before it acts. 3 weeks later, Marcus Vane received intelligence that changed everything. The Council, tired of what they perceived as humanity's prolonged and suspicious silence, had authorized a second enforcement action, larger than Meridian Station, targeting Earth's remaining orbital defenses directly. The strike was scheduled to begin within days. I remember standing in the command center when that intelligence arrived, watching Elena Brooks look at Marcus Vane across the room, both of them understanding at the exact same moment that the choice we had spent nearly a year preparing for had just been made for us. Elena spoke first. She said it was time. Marcus nodded and gave the order that would end the quiet part of this story forever. The tactical display lit up with a wall of red icons dropping out of transit space above Earth, and I felt my pulse spike the way it had inside that shuttle a year earlier, because for one terrible second, watching the numbers climb, I thought we were about to lose everything before our answer ever had the chance to begin. I stood in the command chair Marcus Vane had once occupied, because he insisted I be the one to give the first order, and when I asked him why, he said the Council had made me watch their verdict from a chamber built to make me feel small, and now I would be the one to make them watch our answer from wherever they felt safest in the galaxy. The enforcement fleet above us believed they were about to repeat what had worked at Meridian Station, arriving in force against defenses they expected to find, weakened by months of careful, apologetic silence from our leadership. Instead, the moment their lead vessels crossed into range, their own systems began failing in ways their engineers had never encountered, shields flickering under attacks that matched no weapon signature in their records, because Elena Brooks had spent nearly a year building something new, something drawn from patterns of their own technology turned back against them in ways they had never imagined possible. I remember gripping the arms of that chair as the display filled with conflicting reports from the enemy fleet, confusion spreading through their formation faster than any of us had dared hope, entire squadrons breaking away from coordinated attack patterns because their communications had started failing exactly where Oliver Finch's team had designed them to fail. I remember Oliver himself, steady now in a way I had never seen from him before, opening a channel directly into the enemy fleet, bypassing every layer of Council filtering so that every soldier on every ship heard, in their own language, a message we had prepared months in advance. The message was simple. We had not attacked first, we had not asked for this, and we would not stop until the Council understood, completely and permanently, that Meridian Station would never happen again to anyone. The enforcement fleet retreated within hours, their commanders clearly unprepared for a resistance that did not match the predictable panic they had encountered in every other quarantine they had ever enforced. I remember the strange, hollow quiet of that first victory, because it did not feel like triumph. It felt like confirmation that everything Elena and Marcus and Claire had built in that mountain for nearly a year had actually worked exactly as intended, and confirmation that we had, at last, taken back some measure of control over what happened to us. But retreat was never going to be the end of it, and none of us believed it would be. Marcus Vane stood beside me as the Council fleet withdrew, and he said something I have never forgotten. He said we had just shown the Council that Earth could defend itself. Now we needed to show the rest of the galaxy something far more important. We needed to show every species trapped inside that alliance, out of fear that the Council could be made to answer for what it had done. That was when Claire Bennett's work became the center of everything. Over the following weeks, using the communications framework Oliver had built, we released the records Grace Whitfield had spent months assembling. Every broken promise, every quiet erasure of species who had once questioned Council authority, every detail of what actually happened at Meridian Station, translated into the language of every member species in that alliance, broadcast simultaneously in a way the Council's own filtering systems could not intercept in time to stop it from being heard. I remember watching the reaction ripple outward across systems we had never even visited, through intelligence networks Elena's team had spent years quietly building. Species who had stayed silent within the Council for centuries out of fear suddenly had, for the first time, undeniable proof that their fear had never been irrational. They had proof that the alliance protecting them was capable of erasing an entire civilian population and calling it correction. They had proof, delivered by a species the Council had publicly dismissed as unrefined and dangerous, that resistance was not only possible, but survivable. Administrator Vell issued a statement 3 days later, calling our broadcast an act of manipulation, insisting the records had been altered, insisting the Council's history of protecting its member species remained untarnished. I remember watching that statement with Grace Whitfield beside me, and I remember her laughing quietly for the first time in months, not out of amusement, but out of something closer to disbelief. She said Vell had just made the same mistake he made in that chamber a year earlier. He assumed nobody would check. Within days, 3 member species formally requested independent verification of the records we had released. The Council refused, citing procedural concerns, and that refusal alone did more damage to their credibility than anything we could have said ourselves. Species that had never questioned Council authority in living memory began asking, quietly at first and then loudly, why an alliance with nothing to hide would refuse a simple request for verification. Marcus Vane used that growing uncertainty exactly the way he had planned to from the very beginning. Rather than launching a broad offensive against Council territory, our forces targeted a small number of enforcement outposts, the same kind of installations responsible for actions like Meridian Station, always announcing our intentions in advance through Oliver's communications network, always giving civilian populations time to evacuate before any action began. We were careful, deliberately and visibly careful, in a way that stood in stark contrast to everything the Council had done to us. There was one operation during that campaign that tested every principle we had built our strategy around, and I remember it more sharply than almost anything else from that period, because for several long hours it seemed certain to fail. A joint team led by Marcus had moved to secure an enforcement outpost on the edge of Council territory, expecting minimal resistance based on intelligence gathered weeks earlier. Instead, they found the outpost reinforced far beyond expectations, and for a stretch of hours that felt endless from where I sat monitoring the operation, communication with our forces went dark entirely. I remember standing beside Elena Brooks in that command center, watching a display that showed nothing, absolutely nothing, from a team we had sent in with a promise that evacuation warnings would be honored and civilian harm avoided at every possible cost. I remember the specific fear of that silence, different from the fear I had felt on the shuttle a year earlier, because this time the danger was not mine alone to carry. It belonged to people who had trusted our judgment enough to walk into that operation in the first place. Contact returned 4 hours later, faint at first, then clearer, Marcus Vane's voice carrying through static to confirm the outpost had been secured, the evacuation had held, and every civilian within range had reached safety before the operation concluded. I remember the exhale that went through that entire command center, not celebration, just relief, the kind that leaves your legs weak once you finally allow yourself to feel it. Henry Adler watched those campaigns unfold with an expression I had not seen on him since before Meridian Station, something between disbelief and reluctant hope. He told me one evening that he had spent the entire year afraid we would become exactly what we despised in the Council. He said watching Marcus insist on those evacuation warnings, watching Elena refuse to authorize any strike that could not guarantee civilian safety, even after 4 hours of terrifying silence during that one operation, had shown him something he had not expected to see. He said we had found a way to be dangerous without becoming cruel, and that the difference mattered more than he had ever imagined it would. The turning point came nearly 2 months into what the wider galaxy had already started calling the human response, a name we did not choose but did not reject either. A coalition of 11 member species, led quietly by a species called the Thrini, who had lost an entire settlement to council correction nearly a century earlier and had simply never had the means to prove it until Grace's records gave them exactly that, formally withdrew their support from council enforcement operations. They did not declare war on the council. They simply stopped participating in its authority, stopped supplying its fleets, stopped enforcing its quarantines against other species. I remember Elena Brooks reading that announcement aloud in our command center, her voice steady but her hands trembling slightly, because she understood, better than any of us, what it actually meant. The Council's power had never come from technology superior to everyone else's. It had come from unity, real or forced, among hundreds of species too afraid to imagine an alternative. That unity had just cracked, publicly, permanently, in a way no amount of statements from Administrator Vell could repair. More species followed in the weeks after that, some withdrawing quietly, some withdrawing with public statements that echoed the same records we had released months earlier. I remember watching the Council's public appearances grow less frequent, their statements shorter, less confident, the smooth, patient voice I remembered from that first chamber replaced by something closer to defensiveness. Administrator Vell requested direct communication with Earth's leadership for the first time since the original verdict, nearly 4 months after our first defensive strike above Earth. I was in the room when that request arrived, and I remember Grace Whitfield looking at me before answering it, because she said I deserved to be the one who decided how we responded, given everything that had started the day I stood alone in that chamber with 3 empty seats beside me, and nearly did not survive the trip there at all. I told her to accept the request, but on our terms, not theirs. When the connection opened, Vell's colors were duller than I remembered, subdued in a way that told me more than his words ever could. He asked what conditions would end what he called our aggression against council authority. I told him plainly that we had never sought to destroy the council. We had sought only to make it impossible for the council to treat any species, ours or anyone else's, the way it had treated the people of Meridian Station, and the way someone within their alliance had once treated me, in the moments before I ever had the chance to speak in our defense. I told him the terms were simple: full accountability for what happened at Meridian Station, made public and permanent, full independence for every colony and species the Council had ever placed under so-called protective administration against their will, and an end, immediate and unconditional, to the quarantine order that had started all of this. Vell was quiet for a long moment, longer than I had ever seen him pause in that first chamber, where his certainty had never once wavered. When he finally spoke, his voice lacked the smooth confidence I remembered. He said the Council would need time to consider these terms. I told him the Council had given humanity 30 days to comply with a verdict we never agreed to. I told him he had exactly the same amount of time to answer. He did not respond to that. The connection simply ended, and I remember standing in that command center, surrounded by the people who had spent nearly a year building the strength required to make that moment possible, feeling something I had not expected to feel after everything we had endured. Not triumph exactly, something quieter than that. Something closer to the beginning of an ending we had never been certain we would live to see. 30 days later, I would learn exactly how right Marcus Vane had been, a year earlier, when he said an empire built on fear does not need to be conquered, it only needs to be shown that the thing it fears has changed. The Council was about to be shown that lesson in full. The doors to the chamber opened before I had even finished crossing the docking corridor, and that alone told me everything had changed, because a year earlier those same doors had made me wait, small and unimportant, until the Council decided I was worth acknowledging. I walked in with Grace Whitfield, Marcus Vane, Elena Brooks, and Claire Bennett beside me, 4 people who had spent a year turning grief into something the galaxy would never forget, and I felt none of the fear that had gripped me the first time I stood in that ring of floating light. The chamber looked different than I remembered it, though I could not immediately say why, until I realized the difference was not in the room itself, but in how many of the tiers stood empty. Of the 700 delegates who had once watched Vell deliver our verdict with quiet, untroubled certainty, fewer than 300 remained. The Threni coalition and the species who had joined them in the months since had not returned, and their absence sat in that chamber like a presence all its own, louder somehow than any of them speaking would have been. Administrator Vel was still there, seated in the same position he had occupied a year earlier, but the confidence I remembered had been replaced by something careful, something that watched me the way you watch a storm you no longer believe you can outrun. He opened the session, and his voice, when it came, carried none of the smooth patience I remembered. He said the council had reviewed our terms. He said certain member species had expressed strong support for accepting them in full. He said others remained hesitant, concerned about the precedent such an admission would set for the stability of the alliance moving forward. I asked him whether stability built on species too afraid to question their own protectors deserved to be called stability at all. He did not answer that directly. Instead, he asked whether humanity understood what accepting our terms would mean for the Council's authority across every system it governed, whether we understood we were asking an institution centuries old to admit fault in front of every species it had ever claimed to protect. I told him I understood it completely, because I had spent a year watching a species judged unrefined and dangerous build exactly the strength required to make that admission unavoidable. I told him the Council had been given 11 years to observe humanity before delivering its verdict, and that in all that time, it had never once bothered to ask what we actually valued, what we would forgive, and what we never would. I told him that someone in his own alliance had tried to end my life before I ever finished speaking in this very chamber, and that whoever gave that order had understood, long before the rest of the Council did, exactly how dangerous a single human voice could become if it was ever allowed to be heard in full. I watched something shift in Vel's expression as I said that, the first flicker of genuine surprise I had ever seen cross his features, and I understood in that moment that he had not known about the attack on my shuttle, or had not known its full extent, and that the realization was landing on him now, in front of every remaining delegate in that chamber, as evidence of exactly how fractured his own authority had become even before we ever fired a single strike in return. Claire Bennett spoke next, and I remember the chamber growing quieter than I had ever heard it, as she laid out, calmly and without a trace of anger in her voice, the full record of every species the Council had erased or silenced across its long history, cross-referenced now with testimony gathered directly from those species in the months since our first broadcast reached them. She said the Council had built an empire on the assumption that no species would ever gather enough courage or enough strength to compare notes. She said humanity had simply been the first to do both at the same time. I watched several remaining delegates shift uncomfortably in their tears as she spoke, species who had clearly never heard these records laid out in full before, species who had trusted the Council's authority precisely because they had never been given a reason strong enough to question it. I understood, watching their reactions, that Claire's calm, careful delivery was doing more damage in that moment than any weapon Elena's team had ever built. Vel attempted, once more, to argue that the records had been manipulated, that humanity could not be trusted as a neutral source given our open conflict with Council authority. It was Elena Brooks who answered him this time, and her voice carried none of the technical precision I associated with her work in that mountain facility. It carried something closer to exhaustion, the exhaustion of someone who had spent a year building things she never wanted to build, for a purpose she had never wanted to need. She said the records had already been independently verified by 3 member species with no prior alliance with Earth whatsoever. She said the only thing humanity had actually contributed to this process was the courage to make those records public in the first place, courage that every other species trapped in this alliance out of fear had apparently lacked for centuries. She said the Council's real objection was never to the accuracy of the records, it was to the fact that they could no longer control who heard them. I remember the silence that followed her words, a silence unlike anything I had experienced in that chamber before, not the smug, patient silence of judges who already knew the outcome, but the uncertain silence of an institution watching its own foundation crack in real time, with nothing left to say that would stop it. Marcus Vane spoke last, and he did not raise his voice, though I think many in that chamber expected him to. given everything he had helped build in the year since Meridian Station. Instead, he spoke quietly, almost gently, in a tone I had never heard him use before. He said humanity had never wanted to become a threat to anyone. He said every strategy, every piece of technology, every careful evacuation warning issued before a single strike against Council installations had been built around one simple principle: that strength without restraint was exactly the failure that had led to Meridian Station in the first place, and that we refused to become the thing we were fighting against. He said the Council had one final choice remaining, not between strength and weakness, but between an ending that preserved some measure of its dignity and one that did not. Vel did not answer immediately. I watched him look around that chamber, at the empty tiers, at the remaining delegates who no longer met his eyes with the same trust they once had, and I understood, watching him in that moment, that he had finally realized what the rest of us had understood for months. The Council's authority had never depended on the strength of its fleets or the reach of its bureaucracy. It had depended entirely on species believing they had no other choice but obedience. That belief was gone now, and nothing Vel said in that chamber would ever bring it back. He accepted our terms 3 hours later, in a vote that barely reached the minimum threshold required for Council action, a threshold that would have been unthinkable a year earlier, when 700 delegates had unanimously agreed to erase our future without a second thought. Meridian Station's history was made public and permanent, its records preserved in every archive across every member species, a memorial no administration could ever quietly file away again. Every colony and species the Council had ever placed under so-called protective administration was granted full independence, a list far longer than any of us had realized until it was finally read aloud in that chamber. Name after name after name, entire civilizations returned to themselves after generations of quiet control. And the quarantine order against Earth was lifted, unconditionally, exactly 1 year and 30 days after it had first been announced. I do not remember celebrating when the vote concluded. None of us did. Grace Whitfield simply reached over and took my hand, and we stood there together in that chamber, watching an institution that had once judged our entire species in less time than it takes to eat a meal finally admit, in front of everyone it had ever claimed authority over, that it had been wrong. The Council did not disappear after that day, not immediately. It continued to exist for a while longer, smaller, quieter, its authority reduced to little more than a coordinating body among species who no longer needed its permission to govern themselves. Administrator Vel resigned his position within the year, and no successor ever filled it with the same certainty he once carried into that chamber. Meeting after meeting grew shorter, attendance grew sparser, until eventually the sessions simply stopped being called at all, not through any formal dissolution, but through a slow, quiet fading, the natural end of an institution that had lost the fear it once relied upon to hold itself together. I returned to Earth in the weeks that followed, and I remember standing again in my own kitchen, looking at the same photograph of my sister that had sat there since the day this all began. I did not put it away. I do not think I ever will. I kept it exactly where it was, not as a wound reopened every morning, but as a reminder of exactly what we had chosen to become in the year since her name moved from one list to another. I found Owen Grant again, months after everything had settled, the young pilot who had fought so hard to keep our shuttle in the air, the day someone tried to make sure I never reached that chamber at all. He was flying transport routes now, ordinary routes, quiet routes, the kind of work that did not involve dodging fire on final approach. I asked him if he ever thought about that day. He told me he thought about it often, not with fear, but with a strange kind of gratitude, because he said surviving that attack had shown him, long before the rest of the galaxy understood it, exactly how much humanity was capable of when it refused to be silenced. Grace Whitfield returned to diplomatic work, though the shape of that work changed entirely, no longer built around pleading our case to an authority that had never intended to listen, but around helping newly independent species navigate a galaxy that no longer had a single voice deciding everyone's fate. Marcus Vane remained with the fleet, though he spoke often, in the years that followed, about hoping it would never again be needed the way it had been needed that year. Elena Brooks continued her research, though I know she quietly hoped, more than anyone, that whatever she built next would never again be required for the reasons the continuance had been required. Claire Bennett's records became the foundation of a new archive, maintained jointly by dozens of formerly silent species, dedicated to making certain that no institution, however old or however powerful, could ever again erase a civilization and call it correction without the entire galaxy knowing exactly what had happened. Henry Adler visited me once, nearly 2 years after that final session in the chamber, and he told me something I have carried with me ever since. He said he had spent the entire crisis afraid that our resistance would make us no different from the thing we were resisting. He said watching everything that followed, the careful warnings before every strike, the insistence on evidence over rage, the terms we demanded in that final chamber, terms built around accountability rather than revenge, had shown him something he had not expected humanity to prove capable of. He said we had found a way to make the galaxy afraid of us without ever becoming something worth fearing in return, and he said that difference, more than any weapon Elena had ever built, was the real reason the Council's silence had lasted. I think about that conversation often, more than almost anything else from those years. I think about a shuttle shaking apart around me before I had even spoken a single word in humanity's defense. I think about a chamber that once held 700 confident voices, certain of their authority, certain that a species they had barely bothered to understand posed no real threat worth taking seriously. I think about how that same chamber, within 2 years, fell so quiet that its sessions simply stopped happening at all, not through destruction, not through conquest, but through the slow, complete collapse of the fear that had held it together in the first place. Humanity did not win because we became stronger than the Council in the way they measured strength. We won because we understood something they never once bothered to learn about us in 11 years of observation. We understood that a species capable of grief is also, always, a species capable of resolve, and that resolve, carried carefully rather than carelessly, is harder to defeat than any fleet or any weapon ever built. I still keep that photograph in my kitchen. I still think of my sister every single morning, and I still think of Administrator Vell's voice, calm and untroubled, describing her death as a necessary correction. I do not think that voice exists anywhere in the galaxy anymore, not with that same certainty, not after everything that followed. The chamber that once judged us so easily fell silent, permanently, and I was there to watch it happen, standing exactly where I had once stood alone, with 3 empty seats beside me, except this time surrounded by everyone who had helped make certain that silence would last.